We all want to help one another. Human beings are like that.
Overthinking things as usual.
Hello, lovelies. Freshly bathed Grim here. Today I want to look into the concept of national character and how we can make that and other sort of personality traits more relevant in our games and our fiction, and perhaps think about them on a slightly deeper level. Yeah, I would have called this series of videos like a slight case of overthinking, but that's too big of a title to put in each time. But the idea here is that I willfully and pretentiously overthink ideas. Might seem pointless and wasteful, but when it comes to acting, for example, or screenwriting, a lot of great writers and directors, and this goes for other fields as well, they do a massive amount of research and writing that you don't see, but which informs what you do see and lends it a certain amount of weight and a more believable sense of reality to it. And so that's kind of what I'm getting into here. How does fantasy race or species, environment and nationhood shape personalities potentially in the cultures in our games? So let's have a think. The term national character refers to the kind of collective personality traits, behaviors and values that become associated with a particular nation or a particular group of people, or even a subset within a nation. Here in Britain, for example, we have the English, who primarily see themselves as British, and everybody else who primarily sees themselves as Welsh or Scottish or Northern Irish. So things get complicated here in the UK, and perhaps it's a bit more present in our thoughts than with a lot of other people. But the idea of a national character is a way of understanding how cultural identities are formed and expressed, and even how they change over time. In games, this concept becomes a tool of world building and character development, because you can have players or NPCs playing to type or playing against type, and both choices inform us about the world, the character, and what's going on in there. But not a lot of games really delve into the culture of different societies, different races, sometimes it's species, but very rarely the character of different nations. One of the few exceptions to this is the Iron Kingdoms books, which have many different human cultures, never mind everything else, and each of those has a different sort of character and feel to it, roughly analogous to cultures from the real world. Khador is very clearly Russians, for example, and so on. But then it also has the non-human cultures, which are given the same degree of attention, to an extent. And some of those fantasy races in that are split between different forms as well. Now, in the real world, human racial differences are almost entirely superficial, and cultural and individual variations far outweigh any possible genetic distinction that anyone might attempt to draw. But in fantasy settings, races often represent entirely different species with their own unique physiological and psychological and behavioural traits and instincts. And yet, so often we treat these non-human species as humans with silly hats, or the classic Star Trek thing of, okay, these are humans with a bit of rubber stuck on their nose, and they embody a certain human trait taken to an extreme, which is great for storytelling. But let's try looking at something a little bit deeper and less humanocentric. For example, take the elves. Right? Elves are often depicted as graceful and wise, and this reflects their long lifespans and typically their close connection to nature. And yet, even with these things in mind, I don't think we truly reflect on just how different an immortal being's viewpoint on life would be. How patient they might be waiting for things that other people, other species, other races would never wait for. How tolerant they might be, or how bored and debauched they might be because they have seen and experienced everything in their many thousands of years. Dwarves are often portrayed as sturdy and industrious, which mirrors their subterranean lifestyle, their craftsmanship, that sort of cultural aspect to them. But we rarely seem to fully reflect on what a life spent 90% underground would really be like, and what evolutionary, physiological and psychological changes that might were wrought upon them. Like, why aren't dwarves mostly blind and very pale skinned? And maybe it's not just big beards, maybe the hair is all over their body to protect them from the cold of subterranean tunnels. You start to get a very different idea of what a dwarf might be if you start thinking in those terms. To underline this example and take it away slightly from the kind of humanoid thing, imagine if certain animals evolved to be intelligent species, humanoid for sake of argument. How might that animal's inherent nature manifest in their societies in the way that our ape-like nature and ancestry manifests in our societies and interactions? A deer, for example, given intelligence, might come to greatly value community and alertness. Given their natural tendencies as prey animals, they might culturally prefer to run away or surrender rather than to fight, and they can wait it out. They might have a culture centered around vigilance and safety, harmony with nature, quick, reactive decision-making that could come across to other races as panic. And they might be polygamous, many wives to one man, with men being winnowed out through life, and they might not regard that as any sort of tragedy or anything at all. A lion, given intelligence, from being an apex predator, a lion-like species might embody pride and leadership. They might also be more gender dimorphic, in that male lions might be much more big and powerful, but also much more violent, while female lions might be much more cooperative. Their society would likely be quite hierarchical, but men needn't necessarily be on top in that society due to their nature. But there still might be a strong emphasis on honour, bravery, territoriality. I think the way the Aslan are portrayed in Traveller is a reasonably good example of a slightly more truly alien species in the way that they organise themselves, and it's obviously very much taken from lions, right down to the gender roles in the society being similar to how we describe. There also might not be quite so much attachment to children in such a society. When a new male lion takes over a pride, he often kills the cubs of whoever there was there before them. And how might that manifest in a kind of institutional cruelty in such a society that would shock and horrify humans, but which these lion people might regard as entirely normal? A serpentine race might be perceived as being cunning and secretive. That's how we've tended to portray them. But they could have a culture that's one that values knowledge, patience, strategic thinking, perhaps with a reputation for being enigmatic or untrustworthy, and simply because their cold blood makes them patient and slow and careful until they decide to strike. Now, these are speculative traits that can serve as a foundation, but from these sorts of ideas, taking the animal and working it up into something more intelligent, more human-like in some ways, you can create believable cultures for your games, influenced by the animal nature of whatever the intelligent creature is. We're apes, other things might be something else. The environment also plays a crucial and major role in shaping societies and what we might call national character, much more so than genetics. Human communities across various biomes have developed unique adaptations and cultural practices, largely in response to the demands of their surroundings. An extreme form of this might be cannibalism in societies where there is or has been great deprivation. So they create cultural excuses for it, rituals and so on. In harsh, cold tundra environments, survival often depends on cooperation and resourcefulness, and people tend to organise on a more tribal basis because that's smaller and less stressful on the absence of resources. So societies in the tundra tend to value communal effort, resilience, and a deep respect for the natural world around them, which is so relatively empty, but which they make rich through the knowledge that they pass down. Desert dwellers often emphasize things like hospitality and resource conservation, without which people wouldn't be able to survive there. Cultures often revolve around principles of generosity. Being rich and powerful enough to give things away grants you great social standing. Storytelling often plays a big role as people pass oral traditions from one wandering band to another wandering band. And they also pass on a deep understanding and respect for the arid climate they live in that is also transmitted through those same stories. In mountainous regions or other difficult terrain, people often value independence and self-reliance. Inhabitants might develop strong traditions of craftsmanship because they have to rely on these things to survive and move around. There might be a deep practical and spiritual connection to the terrain that they live in, and yet it might also be quite fragmented because it is relatively difficult to move from one spot to another. We even see that on a planetary scale on Earth, because bands of biome tend to follow the amount of sun that's achieved, so it is much easier for cultures and travel to move east to west than it is north to south. This is one of the central premises within Guns, Gems and Steel, which explains why Europe, partially explains why Europe had so much power for such a long time. Greater resilience to disease and a lot of other things that helped Europeans, Eurasians, succeed compared to the global south. So, yeah, environmental factors, right up to the planetary scale, can lead to commonalities between societies that share the same sort of biome, even if they're massively removed from one another. And these environmental factors influence social structures, belief systems, and daily practices, which in turn influence people's personal individual psychology, and as a result, national character as we get to the concept of nations. Nationhood, as we understand it, is a relatively recent development in human history. People would have talked about kingdoms and so on, but they would have identified much more with their local city-state or their local lord than necessarily with the nation as a whole. I don't think nationalism has been terribly good for us overall, this kind of identity. I tend to think that identity politics as a whole tends to be bad for people because it necessarily divides us and sets us against each other. But at least nations are a slightly larger block that allows people who are often very different and from very different areas to cooperate and come together in a way. Now, if we can only move beyond nations, then we might be onto something. But nationhood also, as part of itself, involves a shared identity amongst a much larger group of people, often defined by common language or languages, culture, and territory. So that's where the landscape and the biome can have an effect on a sense of nationhood. So consider a few examples. For example, the British national character is often associated with traits like politeness, reserve, a stiff upper lip, There's a strong sense of tradition and a penchant for understatement. I think living cheek by jowl, relatively speaking, as we do in the UK, helps create that sense of politeness and holding space for other people. Tradition's a weird one because until relatively recently we used to get invaded by every Tom, Dick and Harry, and they left some sort of indelible mark on our culture. And so maybe that's cope. This strong sense of traditionalism and the British identity itself is cope for the fact that we are a gang of mongrel pirates living on an island separate from everyone else. So maybe it's a bit of overcompensation there. It gets interesting when you start thinking about it. American identity often emphasizes rugged individualism, optimism, perhaps overly optimistic, and a belief in the American dream and the sheer novelty and newness of America. That it is a land of opportunity and freedom, and the cultural narrative and identity is very strongly around individualism, freedom, innovation, and a sort of can-do attitude that a lot of the rest of the world frankly finds quite tiresome. In Finland, the national character is frequently linked to concepts like sisu, which is a term that denotes determination, courage, resilience, and just kind of what the British call bloody-mindedness quite often. You just keep going despite everything. The Finns are often seen as modest, honest, taciturn, and connected to their landscape. And very communally driven, though unlike a lot of the other, broadly speaking, Nordics, the Finns seem a lot less outgoing and a lot more cheerful in their own individual way than some of the others. You know, these national characters are shaped by historical events, cultural narratives, shared experiences, and the landscape, the biome in which they're in. And then that creates a kind of self-reinforcing self-image. If that is the national character and we see that as the national character and we share a lot of these influences, we find ourselves conforming to our national character to some extent or another. And then that then becomes embedded in our cultural narratives, our stories, our mythology, all the rest of it, and so it continues to self-reinforce. It's not always a good thing. See, there's often a difference between perception and reality. There's often a gap between how a nation sees itself, its stereotypes that it holds for itself, and how it is viewed by others. I mean, topically, let's take Americans. Within the US, there is a very strong self-image of being this land of opportunity, freedom, equality. However, outside the US, Americans can often be stereotyped as arrogant, ignorant, or overly materialistic, and the American society itself is quite insular, so it rarely sees how other people do things, how other people live, how other people might have greater freedoms in some areas, more equality in some areas, greater opportunity in some areas. But the US is number one at considering itself number one. While other people outside America often see America as loud, rude, boorish, uncultured, tacky. I could go on. The truth probably lays somewhere in the middle, but a lot of it is about how one idea of national character clashes against another idea of national character and different value systems in the two. But also cultural narratives can create blind spots to your own flaws or flaws in your national character. The negative stereotypes tend to stem from various factors, including political actions, media portrayals, cultural misunderstandings. I mean, they're oversimplifications, these stereotypes, whether they're positive or negative, and they don't truly capture the diversity and complexity of any nation's people. But when it comes to games, we can certainly use stereotypes as stand-ins and starting points, because for the most part players don't interact with people on any really deep level. So bringing it all back to games, in tabletop games, if we understand while we're world building or setting something in a particular area, if we understand the interplay between race or species, environment, nationhood, history, and so on, we can thereby enrich our world building and role playing by acknowledging and considering those influences upon the NPCs that we evoke at the table. Consider how a species' inherent traits might influence their culture and interaction, particularly the more distant they are from human. You will massively enrich the roleplay and world building if your races, your species, aren't just humans with funny noses. And that even goes for the standards like elves and dwarves and so on. Reflect on the environment and how that might affect people's daily lives, what they might value, not just in a commercial sense but in a personal sense, and how that might affect the social structures of the inhabitants and even how they live. Do they live communally in long houses, separated out in separate houses? If they're a gnome or a dwarf living out in a hole in the ground, how is that engineered? Because that's a massive investment of effort that has to go in to excavation. How is that reflected? And then nationhood. You know, there are all manner of different human nations in most fantasy settings alongside non-human nations, or even melting pot mixes of all of them. So how did that happen? What are the shared identities and histories that bind these communities, these nations, these city-states, whatever, together? How do they see themselves, and how do other people see them, and why? And then by weaving all these elements together, which I know sounds like a lot of hard work, but it's worth it when you're world building, from all of that you can create nuanced societies, characters that offer depth and authenticity to your game world, quests that make sense in one culture but don't necessarily make sense in another, and which are grounded in the hyper-reality of the NPC inhabitants of that area. And while these frameworks can guide your storytelling, they are ultimately just stereotypes. So bits and bobs will turn up out of them here and there, but just like real life, stereotypes might contain a grain of truth, but just a grain. Zang.
Satana Station is an addition to Machinations of the Space Princess. It's a whole sleazy space station, full of locations, services, adventures, and inspiration for your old-school space opera games. Over 100 locations, a bevy of non-player characters, and more plot hooks than you can shake an Arcturan mega stick at. Buy it at post-mort.com, drive-through RPG, and hard copy at lulu.com.